Okay, quick music disclaimer here. I do not own the rights to this music, which belongs to the rightful owner, who is the intoxicating mind of Dr. Frankenstein. So he made my intro and my outro, and I hope you guys enjoy. Check them out on Spotify and YouTube, and no copyright infringement is intended. Have a good day.
A clear choice of good versus evil, of right versus wrong.
Twisted Tales.
Alright, welcome back to Twisted Tales, folks. Hope we're all doing awesome here. Now, my next little tale, we're going to talk about the case of Christine Marion Jessop. She was born November 29th, 1974. She was from Queensville, York Region Municipality, and this is in Ontario, Canada. So she was a Canadian girl. Now, she had been abducted, raped, and murdered back in October of '84. Now, this case also dives into like some wrongful conviction shit, and eventually the case went on for over 3 decades. So, I'm going to dive into this one with you guys, folks. And let's tell you another tale. So, tale goes. The little girl had been abducted from her home. She was reported missing on October 3rd of 1984. Now, her body was found on New Year's Eve in a farmer's field in the Sunderland Brock Township, which is 55 kilometers away from her home, or I guess 34 miles. And she was stabbed to death and raped. Christine was just like any other vibrant 9-year-old girl. Like, she loved life, she had a loving family, she was going to school, and she also had her hand in some sports. Like, she was pretty outgoing. And it was just hard for the family to have her missing, just like any other family would, right? And you have to cover every angle when shit like this happens. Like, a family member disappears and you don't know what the fuck happened. It's just a very devastating thing. But family and police would soon start firing off an investigation here and looking for answers. The police began investigating and talking to everyone around the area. Family, neighbors, other town members, local businesses, you name it. And they focused on a man named Guy Paul Morin. He was a local Canadian resident. Now, it stated that on October 3rd, 1984, little Christine Jessop had been dropped off at her home by the school bus, and then was going to go meet up with one of her friends over at a nearby park. Now, Christine's mom, Janet Jessop, she ended up getting home and had noticed her school bag was still left on the counter. So, when it got around supper time, the mom had picked up the phone and got on the horn, just to see if some of Christine's friends knew where she was at. And then she went out frantically looking for her daughter, before police were called. The last time that she'd been seen was between the hours of 4 p.m. and 4:30 p.m., and she walked to a nearby store to go grab some bubble gum, and then head over to her friends. So she was last seen entering the store by a witness called, his name was Robert Atkinson. And anything outside of that, nobody would know her whereabouts other than her killer. Now, the store name that she was at was Queensville General Store. And when people found out that she was missing, her face was plastered on every TV set, every fucking newspaper, radio ad, you name it. Now, the police were investigating, questioning sources, witnesses, just people who might have heard something in the night in question. When her body had been found 3 months later on New Year's Eve, it was just fucking brutal. The poor girl was stabbed to death and raped. The semen stains had been found on her underwear, and it was gathered up into police evidence. And shortly after everything was done, everything was packed up, she was buried in the cemetery located behind her family home. And the investigation continued on. Now, the mother, Janet, she mentioned a neighbor, Guy Paul Morin, and this was around the February 14th mark of 1985. So naturally, police had turned their focus onto that dude. And 5 days later, they set up some surveillance of his home. Now, 2 police officers had interviewed him a few days later. This was on February 22nd. Now, this fella here, Guy, at the time of her disappearance, he was working as a finishing sander for a furniture manufacturing firm. And then he played some musical instruments in his spare time, like, for instance, the clarinet and the saxophone, so he had some different hobbies. And this guy here had, like, a few other, like, job titles and shit, like, he used to be a beekeeper, and let's just say the guy kept busy when he wasn't working. Now, police found out that he had helped his parents with renovations to their home, so he was pretty busy back and forth. Some kind of know him as, like, a weird type of guy, like, I guess playing the clarinet was, like, a little odd, I guess, but when there's a little girl's murder, like, you gotta try and think of anything you can think of that might help things, or the info, like, that you get could lead to new clues. Who knows? But people are gonna be questioned regardless. And even during Guy's questioning here, he didn't say or do anything out of the ordinary, or, like, say something along the lines of a confession, anything like that, or that he had been responsible for the little girl's death. Like, he didn't incriminate himself at all or anything, right? Like, well, obviously, why would you, right, if you're being interrogated by police? But something stuck out with the police, because during their questioning, like, even though, like, although it was public knowledge that her body was found near Ravenshoe Road, he mentioned this, and along with a comment that all girls are sweet and beautiful, but grow up to be corrupt. I mean, perhaps it was just the way he said this to police, or maybe it was, like, the way he used his tone of voice. I don't know, like, they thought it to be, like, a little snarky. But he went on to claim his innocence, and by that time, like, deep into the interview, like, he might have become irritated by police for being treated as a suspect. And after the interview was done, police obtained his time card from his work. But, like, this kind of suggested that it would have been very difficult for old Guy here to return from his job, abduct Christine from her parents before they got home, and then, yeah, like, kill her and everything. Like, but they were convinced that they had Christine's killer in their possession. Now, he was arrested on April 22nd, 1985. Police then took some samples of DNA from him, you know, like hair samples, saliva, blood samples, and all this had been voluntarily given by the accused, as he still proclaimed his innocence, and that he had nothing to do with the little girl's death. Although Guy claimed his innocence, police just grilled this fucking guy to no end. Like, he went through hell and high water. Like, they ended up charging him for, like, the little girl's death and everything. And in just a short amount of time, like, the guy was fucking interrogated, he was arrested, and then he was charged. And then the trial was soon to begin. So, at the trial here, now, Morin's defense counsel had argued that he was not guilty of the crime, and they also ran with an alternative argument that if he did commit the crime, then he had a defense of insanity. And that definitely couldn't have looked good for the fucking guy. I mean, just weird. So February 7th, 1986, that rolled around, and the jury had acquitted Guy Morin on the charges of first-degree murder, and he was set free. Now, the Crown had appealed this on the grounds including that the trial judge had improperly prohibited the jury from using the defense evidence of Morin's psychiatric history in determining whether or not he had killed Christine. And the Ontario Court of Appeal ordered a new trial, and the Supreme Court of Canada had upheld this. And the result was that a second trial would begin in 1990. Now, with the Crown calling on a bunch of new witnesses who claimed that they had evidence of Morin's guilty conscience after the death of Christine. And like, I don't know, there's just some shit that kind of went sideways at this second trial for Guy here. Now, there were two witnesses that were locked up in jail. Now, they had a long history of fucking with the authorities, like lying about details of cases, making shit up, just in order to try to get their sentences reduced. So what happened here is that these guys fed the police some bullshit about Guy Morin, and this was at the time when he was in jail. They said that he confessed to the crime of killing little Christine. So the forensic team, they did a comparison on the evidence that they had, like the hair and fiber content and all that shit. And the experts had totally exaggerated the strength of this evidence. And they left out one crucial fact, that analysis couldn't support a positive ID of a particular person or a match, if you will. So this information couldn't be safely relied on. So pretty much the hair and the fiber samples became contaminated. And during Morin's trial, the expert knew this, but they concealed this info from them, right? Like, they hid this from the prosecutors and the police, because they just wanted somebody to go down for this heinous crime, and that was all that was. All in all, just because of, like, some shady evidence and some other bullshit from these guys, like, Guy Morin, like, he was eventually found guilty of first-degree murder. This was on July 30th of 1992. So, over time, not everyone believed that he committed the crime, especially a few people here and there. Like, they actually started an organization to help exonerate him. Now, they called the group the Justice for Guy Paul Morin Committee, and their very first goal was to appeal his conviction, and they also applied for his release on bail, and then Guy had to wait for the appeal to be decided on. So, while he was waiting on that, the committee had some good news. Guy had been granted bail. Now, this was on February 9th, 1993, and despite his murder conviction and all that shit, Guy and the committee had good intentions on winning this upcoming appeal, because they just wanted to prove the information by the two jailed informants was just fucking nonsense. And even like the other fiber evidence against him, it was just bullshit. Like, they had the technology advancements to test the semen samples found at the crime scene. And eventually, they did a more thorough DNA test. And eventually now, that could be conducted. The redo of the DNA samples, like, although most of it had been useless, just from like deterioration and shit from over the years, they were able to get a little sample. Now, the test proved that the DNA in question did not belong to Guy Morin at all. And the Crown prosecutor had to explain to the court, like, he had to go tell everybody, like the media and everything, the details of the new findings. So, he said, quote, "The evidence proves as an indisputable scientific fact that Mr. Morin is not guilty of first-degree murder of Christine Jessop, and should be acquitted." Now, on January 23rd, 1995, the Ontario Court of Appeal had set his conviction and entered the acquittal instead. Now, the Crown apologized to the family for, like, the mistakes, all the bullshit, and, like, everything that he had to endure over the 10 years, like, after his arrest. And he spent 18 months total in prison. Now, he was declared innocent, and his name was officially cleared of any wrongdoing. Now, on January 26, 1996, the Lieutenant Governor inquired, and he looked into, like, Guy's wrongful conviction. Like, why was this guy locked up? What happened? Like, police negligence, all this stuff, whatever, right? And he had identified numerous factors that resulted and contributed into the miscarriage of justice. So, there were some causes on this, and, like, his whole miscarriage of justice shit. Now, the two informants that claimed while Morin was incarcerated, he had confessed to the killings of Christine. Now, they literally just lied to, like, further gain their own interest, right? Now, they both had lengthy criminal records. And one of the inmates, he was informing police that, fucking all this stuff about Guy, and he did this, he confessed to me and that. This guy was diagnosed, like, as a pathological liar, actually. And the other guy was later diagnosed with a personality disorder with sociopathic tendencies. So, just because of their fuckery and improper justice, like, the guy lost, like, fucking 10 years of his life, and that sucks. Morin's conviction had been cited as one of Canada's most famous wrongful conviction cases, and it led to how police investigated murders in Canada. So, although nothing can be, like, fucking restored for Guy here, like the years of his life, his peace of mind, Guy had also received $1.25 million in compensation for his wrongful conviction from the Ontario government. So, this guy, guy, he got married, he had kids, and he even produced a CD for his clarinet music. Now, that's nothing weird about that, right? So, a few things before his arrest that people think was kind of suspicious was, like, the fact that he didn't join in the search for the girl. He didn't attend her funeral back in '85, and I don't really see how that shit overly matters, because I've covered cases where the killer had did both of those things. Like, that's usually bringing on suspicion, if you ask me. But, you know, what do you do, right? Now, Morin, like, his afterthought on all this shit that happened to him, like, he mentioned this to reporters, so it goes like this. No one will ever look at me again and say, he might have done it. I had the dagger hanging over my head all right, but this is like a motion picture ending. Now, Morin used his compensation payment to purchase some land, and had a farmhouse, and this is just north of Toronto. And he married a member of the support team. Now, she had helped him prove his innocence, and he opened up a small business. Now, this is called Paul's Handiworks, and then he later gained employment at Toronto Pearson's airport as a maintenance worker. And for years after this, he refused to speak to the media or make, like, any public appearances, any of that shit. And one of his last interviews that he did was of him mentioning that it's true I've had my little spurts of anger, but I knew my day of exoneration would soon come. And, like, now if it wasn't Guy Morin that committed the crime, then who was to blame for it all? And that's just a question that'll take a little bit of time here to be solved. So let's try to get into this here. And it wasn't until about October of 2020 that Toronto police could have technical advancements with genealogy tracing. Now, genealogy tracing is an advanced form of DNA testing that police were able to actually link a semen sample to a man named Calvin Hoover. And this was a man who had never been a suspect in the case. But unfortunately, he committed suicide back in 2015. And we'll get into that. Now, when they announced the DNA evidence findings to the public, Police Chief James Raymer had told them and the media that if he were alive today, the Toronto Police Service would arrest Calvin Hoover for her murder. Now, Guy Morin also had something to say on this matter. Even though he didn't really talk to the public, he made a statement that had been released by his lawyer. So this says, quote, I'm grateful Toronto police stayed on the case, and they finally solved it. I was sure that one day DNA evidence would reveal the real killer, and now it has. Just fucking police work found this guy here. Like, there's a few other things too that played its part. So now they had a suspect in the October 3rd, 1984 murder of Christine. Now, how they found this guy's DNA, like, besides being at the crime scene, it was on file. A man named Ken, this guy was a second cousin once removed of Hoover. So he had uploaded his DNA to several genealogy sites, which built up a large family tree. And this eventually led to Calvin Hoover being part of his family. And this had been a key factor in her murder case. Now, Hoover lived near the Jessop family, and he was an occasional acquaintance to the family. And the Jessops, they even visited fucking Calvin Hoover 2 days before Christine's murder. And it just must have been crazy watching all this unfold, like, before he took his own life and shit, like, watching an innocent man get blamed for his crimes, and then watching that man be exonerated, and then the case be looked into again. And guaranteed panic and every other guilty feeling set in, like a true what the fuck moment at that, if there ever was one. Around this time, like, Hoover just fucking fell apart. Like, he lost his wife, her name was Heather. He began to drink heavily, using drugs. Hoover was able to evade police capture for over 3 decades, so like 36 fucking years later. And like I mentioned earlier about like killers being part of the search team and shit, Calvin had helped in the search for Jessop when she had first been reported missing, and he even attended her wake. And then it's just like he dropped off the fucking radar. And like I previously said, like the other cases that I covered, like the killers would actually go to their wake and like go to the search parties and shit. And this actually happened in this one too. Even though like Guy never went to all that, they thought that was weird. But you'd think it'd be fucking weird for showing up. I don't know. He actually kept employed throughout all this too. Like he worked at like telecom firms and shit. Those are places that provide like telephones and telephone related material. Now Hoover's wife, she was interviewed by the York Regional Police the day after her disappearance. And police had talked to like neighbors' homes, and although like his name was brought up like more than once, like she made mention that Calvin was looking after the kids. And nothing more was added to her statement, and nobody ever fucking looked at this guy again. And Hoover was never actually questioned directly by police. There's no real reason given by police about the oversight on why he was never questioned, like, this was just never explained. Now, police even received some tips that were called in about a silver Datsun with a rounded roof that was seen in Queensville the day of Jessop's abduction. But Hoover actually owned a gray Pontiac Phoenix. This was a compact vehicle that kind of resembled the Datsun vehicle. Now, police believe that he followed the case rather closely for over a decade, and his suicide, police think that Hoover had begun to grow concerned about police connecting the dots and fingering him for the crime. Now, the frequent cocaine use and heavy drinking, this had played a factor in his mental health decline. Now, even in 1997, him and Heather divorced. She ended up taking the kids. And Calvin remarried in 2003 to a woman named Joanne Rocca. But his life was all over the fucking map by then, and he kind of kept things on the down low. The two had lived in Waterloo, Ontario, before she died in 2009. Now, police even found that Hoover had some outdated charges when they had ID'd his body. He was convicted on impaired driving, and he was fined $800, and this also resulted in him losing his license for a period of 1 year while he was living in Ajax, Ontario. And it was reported here that Global News, they discovered that Hoover was living in Port Hope on a rural property in 2015. So he died by asphyxiation. Now Hoover's son went away, and he came back, and he found him dead, hanging in the garage. And the ownership of Calvin Hoover's home was transferred into his son's name a little before his death. Now, Kenny Jessop, Christine's brother, he made mention that, although he was like an acquaintance or whatever, he used to babysit them as kids, and he sometimes remember Hoover being around sometimes. Hoover's first wife, Heather, she worked with Christine's father, Bob, at Eastern Independent Telecom. Now, Bob, he says that he doesn't really remember much about Hoover. Now, Bob learned of Hoover's involvement, and he said it's unbelievable to a degree as to why he'd even do it. It seems to me that he must have had something wrong with them, or he must have had some reason for it. I can't figure out what it would have been. I really don't know. Now, Toronto police spoke to about 50 people that knew Calvin Hoover, just trying to learn like who he was, who he hung out with, where he spent time, and he was looking into like other unsolved cases that could maybe involve him. Now, the Hoover family has even talked with police, and they provided them with information too. They've just been really helpful on the whole matter. And never once did Bob ever suspect Hoover. He believes Hoover was over the house a few times on work-related matters and shit. but he can't really recall because he had a crew of over like 20 guys working for him at the time. Now, Bob is now suffering from Alzheimer's, but he does have a recollection of Hoover. And he says here, I would have lined him up and blew his brains out if I would have known. And the death of his daughter totally destroyed him, he said. There are a lot of victims in this, but it was Christine that suffered the most. And he can now go to bed, not wondering who killed his precious daughter. And that's it. That's all I got for you folks. I hope you guys enjoyed this twisted tale here. Have yourself a wonderful day.
The rural field where Christine Jessop's mutilated body was found in 1984 served only as a starting point. Police now say this 4-decade-old investigation is covering more ground and hearing from more witnesses who all say they had no inkling DNA would eventually point to Calvin Hoover as the killer.
We're learning more about the people that he spent time with, where he spent time, and we're looking at any unsolved cases that may be out there that Calvin could have been involved in.
Since police named Hoover last week as their sole suspect, investigators say they've heard from more than 50 people who knew him. Family members, old friends, and colleagues, all apparently just as stunned as Christine's father, Bob.
He worked for us. So that was the unknown thing at the time, and unbelievable to a degree as to why he would even do it.
Bob Jessop had worked with Hoover's then wife. That's how the families knew each other. Long since divorced, Heather Hoover says she's devastated by the news. She says, our hearts go out to the Jessop family. We ask for privacy at this time while we all come to terms with this horrendous news that was as shocking to us as it was to the Jessop family. The lead investigator says Hoover's relatives have been very helpful. Still, he's traveling high and low, convinced someone is holding a secret.
There may be someone out there that Calvin talked to and had told these things to, and that person may or may not feel comfortable about coming forward.
Investigators haven't yet found forensic evidence tying Hoover to any other crime, but they can be certain he's not committing any now. Hoover took his own life 5 years ago.
To provide an overview, it was October 3rd, 1984, when 9-year-old Christine Jessop went missing from her home in Queensville, Ontario, just north of Toronto in York Region. She was described as a girl who loved life, her family, school, and sports. Her face, as seen here today, was on every television set and every newspaper. Hundreds of community members assisted in searching for Christine. Tragically, on December 31st, 1984, Christine was found in Sunderland, Ontario, in Durham Region. She had been stabbed to death, and evidence that she had been sexually assaulted was located at the crime scene. The investigation, as we know, resulted in the arrest of Guy Paul Morin. He was acquitted at his first trial, found guilty of first-degree murder at his second trial, before a successful Crown appeal ultimately led to his acquittal in 1995 on fresh evidence that was submitted jointly by both the Crown and the defense. At that time, the fresh evidence was DNA that conclusively established Guy Paul Morin was not the donor of semen stains found on Christine Jessop's underwear. I am not here today to revisit that historical investigation. We are fortunate to have had the very thorough public inquiry and resulting recommendations from Justice Kaufman. I am here because of the diligent work of Toronto police investigators. On Friday, October 9th, 2020, we positively confirmed the identification of the person responsible for the DNA sample found on Christine's underwear. Calvin Hoover of Toronto, Ontario, was 28 years old in 1984. He was known to the Jessop family at the time of Christine's disappearance. He died in 2015. However, if he were alive today, the Toronto Police Service would arrest Calvin Hoover for the murder of Christine Jessop. Today's announcement is only the first very important answer in this ongoing investigation. It has obviously generated many more questions, and we are asking for the public's help as we look for information about Calvin Hoover, in an effort to create a timeline of his whereabouts and the last moments of Christine's life. Please take a look at this photo. It is a photo of Mr. Hoover that dates back to the late 1990s. Despite how dated it is our hope that it may jog someone's memory about the events surrounding Christine's disappearance. If you have any information, no matter how insignificant it may seem, please contact police.
If you like paranormal, true crime, cryptids, or anything else weird, check out the Ouch Was That a Ghost podcast brought to you by your host Liz. You can find Ouch Was That a Ghost on Spotify, Apple, or any other audio platform. New episodes drop every Thursday.
Twisted Tales.